Here follows an extract from my book Artful Designs, available from Amazon. Chapter 12, Part 2. There was no doubt that Hyacinth had enjoyed preparing for tonight, and her eye for detail was evident everywhere. The table was laid with silver cutlery atop a black tablecloth, and each setting was laid around a purple silk placemat. The backs of the dining chairs were covered with a shimmering purple chiffon scarf elegantly finished in a bow at the back. A sprig of lavender was the finishing touch to each napkin. Beth had noticed that the canapé trays were decorated with various flower heads, and now saw a striking arrangement lying low and long down the centre of the table. Guessing it to be Hyacinth's work, she complimented her friend on the beauty of the centrepiece. I chose to make the arrangement as I wanted to be sure we'd see each other as we dine. There's nothing worse than trying to hold a conversation over dinner through a jungle in the middle of the table, explained Hyacinth. Overhearing the topic of their conversation, Conrad joined in. The point here is that we all actually want to chat together. I did, however, once go to a business dinner where the host admitted to me that he particularly placed guests opposite him with a large floral centrepiece between them because he positively detested them and wished to avoid any sort of exchange. He said it worked a treat and he'd recommend the trick to anybody. We're honoured that you designed a low arrangement then, Hyacinth, said Drew. But if I'm ever placed by a tall bunch of flowers, I know I'll develop an inferiority complex. Now you've told me that. The first course was brought through by Hetty and Emma. They had been carefully tutored to properly serve each dish. It had been explained that serve from the left, removed from the right was an urban myth. Food is only served from the left if it is to be removed from a platter, the chef explained. The thinking behind this is that it presumes the servant and recipient are right-handed. It was with gratitude that Henrietta stood at Drew's right and placed his crab-stuffed avocado without too much awkwardness. Being left-handed, the concept of left-side serving would have been tricky. As it was, the blue barrage floral decoration to the starter dish stayed artfully in place. Hyacinth's influence could be seen in every course, and flowers figured greatly in the menu, both as ingredients and as garnish. A main course of lamb shank and lavender with minted new potatoes, decorated with purple chive heads, continued the theme. Lemon tart, decorated with lemon balm leaves and tiny white lemon balm blossoms, stayed with the floral theme, and the cheese and biscuit boards were lavishly scattered with edible blossoms. Even the radishes were sculpted into tiny mice which ostensibly nibbled roses and marigold heads. The conversation inevitably turned to the museum, and as nobody seemed to mind talking shop, the topic of the missing constable was covered once again. I have to admit that I'm sick to the heart because of it all, said Theo. It makes a mockery of my life's work. I love the art for its own sake, of course, but I also love its place as a marker in our social history. To me, it represents a bastion of who we are and where we come from. But now that somebody has died, maybe even two will die if Scott's chum doesn't pull through. Well, is it really worth it? A human life is worth more than some paint on a piece of paper when all's said and done. And just think about this, said Theo, warming to his theme. We're surrounded by works of art every day, and they attract no special notice. That's a crime in itself, and I'm guilty of overlooking it for all these years. I do take your point, Theo, said Drew. It's inevitable that you should be unsettled by what's taken place. But it's also inevitable that an accepted canon is formed. It's the same with music and literature. Some works attain renown, whereas others, maybe even those with more merit, pass by unnoticed. It's a shame that this trouble has jaded your enthusiasm. By all means enjoy and appreciate the everyday wonders, but don't discard your love of the established great, said Sally. Constable waited his whole life for such recognition. Don't deny it now. Don't you think we get weighed down with concentrating on the everyday art from centuries ago and stand the chance of missing the beauty that is freely around us today? It's ludicrous when you think about it. Here we are, the six of us. Conrad, Sally and I get kudos and acclaim for hoarding and eulogising work that's not our own making, whereas Hyacinth, Beth and Drew create beauty every day as a matter of course. Hyacinth designs gardens and floral sculptures that would shame Capability Brown. Drew paints with skill and creativity every day of the week, and Beth quietly stitches small miracles just because of the outpouring of her heart, said Theo. Steady on, Theo, exclaimed Hyacinth. You exaggerate simply to make your point stick. Nonsense, look at the table and the dishes we've had tonight. Beautiful. And have you seen Beth's embroideries? They're so intricate and beautiful. In fact, I mean to go further. I want to buy one, Beth. How much would you accept so that I could have one for myself? Asked Theo. I'm not sure that I could charge you anything, if I thought you were at all serious, said Beth. They take me so long to sew, I really couldn't put a price on them, and I would hardly charge my friends. Do be serious, Theo. Don't you see? It's not fair for you to keep them all to yourself. Beauty should be shared. At least I can walk in Hyacinth's garden and see what she has done and enjoy it. The museum is still closed, or I'd demand you hold an exhibition. As it is, you really should let your friends benefit from sharing in what you make. Drew tells me that you've just finished a small Celtic design and are waiting to get it framed. What size is it, Beth? I want to buy it, Theo demanded. I hardly know if you're joking. It's a little smaller than A4 landscape. But if you're quite serious, I'll make a gift of it to you. You may be disappointed when you see it, said Beth. Hyacinth could see that her friend was acutely embarrassed at suddenly finding herself in the spotlight and stepped in to dissipate the attention. Theo is hardly without accomplishment, despite what he'd have us believe, she said. We'll move back into the lounge for coffee and some inevitably delicious handmade truffles. While we relax, Theo can repay our hospitality by playing the piano for us. Since our son Quentin emigrated to America, the piano doesn't get nearly enough attention, and my feeble attempts are an insult to such an instrument. If we're talking about the necessity of sharing one's gifts, then it's your turn to be bountiful, Theo. Theo laughed at seeing the tables turned upon him. Touché, madam, he said, bowing as he spoke. You now wish me to parade my ignorance before a real musician. Well, I asked for it. Turning to Beth, Theo said, Here's the deal. You will be patient and encouraging while I stumble through some Beethoven and Schumann, and in return you will reward me with the embroidery I covet. Deal? He stuck out his hand so as to strike a bargain. Beth laughed and shook his hand to seal the deal. You'll get the worst of it, she said. You've seriously overrated my needlework skills, and if you play any Beethoven, then I'm in awe. I never can play Beethoven convincingly. I've no idea what your Beethoven playing abilities are, Beth. But don't be misled, ladies and gentlemen. I know for a fact that the beautiful outfit that Beth is wearing tonight is made entirely by her own fair hand. Every stitch of it, said Conrad. I think that's quite enough flattery, said Drew. I've heard what sort of language emanates from my dear wife when she's sewing, and it's not pretty, I can tell you. Bring out the coffee and let's be sensible. Emma and Hetty brought through the coffee and truffles. Emma gave a knowing nod to her parents, acknowledging the over-pink faces that may or may not be attributed to a little too much good wine. They've started round the piano, and I know that my dad has bought a bottle of his precious single malt, so we might as well have a break before we tackle these last dishes, said Emma. I'm catching a lift home later with Mum and Dad, so there's no rush. Is Bobby picking you up? The chef had finished and left, leaving the two young ladies to finish off by themselves. Emma made good her promise of a break by bringing a pot of coffee to the table and some truffles which had been left for them. Bobby doesn't want his mum out late, so he's staying with Toby. I'm getting a taxi when we finish, said Hetty. We'll have this brew and then we'll crack on to get finished. Maybe we can share a taxi and get home before the clock strikes 12 and we turn into pumpkins. Maybe you can squeeze in a cup of cocoa before Bobby goes home. Emma left the last comment hanging, suggesting that this might not be quite the full story. Hetty laughed at her friend's delicacy. I'm in no rush, so we'll see. She took a sip of her coffee and closed her eyes as she enjoyed the dreamy luxury of the truffle before she sat and looked earnestly at her friend. She took a moment to decide if she really wanted to pursue the conversation she was forming in her mind, and then, after a small nod of decision, continued. You've been such a good friend to me, Emma, particularly in the way that you've not pried and asked awkward questions. I'm really grateful to you for that, but I think it's only fair to tell you something about myself. If it wasn't for your kindness, I don't think I'd have stayed here, and then I'd never have met Bobby. Because of your friendship, I've managed to overcome my shyness and timidity, and I've managed to settle down. There's no great conspiracy or secrecy, it's just that I wasn't ready to deal with things and talk about them. Until now, that is. Emma said nothing to push or pry. She didn't expect details, but just poured out the coffee and listened. Toby's dad was in the Rifles Regiment. He was one of the first troops when the regiment was newly formed. It was a tough life, but I liked it nevertheless. There was a real sense of community. We all looked out for each other. Jez loved it so much. He chose the Rifles because of their motto, swift and bold. He'd have been right up at the front, totally fearless. Heedless, you might say. He went on tour to Afghanistan. He never came back. Some of his friends made it back, at least physically intact, if not mentally. Many came back with neither bodies nor minds intact. I'm not sure that Jez would have coped with that. But I guess that's what they all say. He never knew about Toby. He never knew that I was pregnant. It was never my intention to hide anything, Hetty continued. Toby had never even heard of his dad, and it never really came into conversation when he was a baby. If he ever asks, I'll tell him, and I'll make sure he knows all about his dad. But for now, he's content and he doesn't think about such things. I left barracks and stayed with my mum, but without being disrespectful, my mum was never one for home comforts and TLC. It was the place to stay, but I knew I'd have to leave sooner or later. I have a small army pension that I can draw upon unless I remarry, and so I took out a map of the area I thought I might like and decided to move. Then I literally closed my eyes and stuck a pin in the map, and it brought me here. Initially, Emma was moved to tears whilst listening to her friend's tragic story, but now she laughed heartily. You live here because you stuck a pin in a map? Who'd have thought it? I'm so glad it brought you here. She gave her friend an affectionate hug. However, if your pin had landed elsewhere, you might not be faced with the prospect of all these dishes. I'd better go and see if our esteemed diners want a final drink, and then we'll get finished and get to bed. I'm shattered. The dinner guests had sagged a little. Shoes had been kicked off and ties loosened. Beth and Thea were sitting at the piano scrutinising some Schumann duets which they decided needed more preparation for a date to be named in the not-too-distant future. The prospect of more fine fare had lost its appeal, and, in response to Emma's offer of drinks, it transpired that everybody now craved a regular mug of tea. Your duties are complete, so I'll come and make the tea, insisted Hyacinth. If you can put the kettle on, I'll finish off in the kitchen in the morning. I'll be through to the kitchen in just a moment, and if you're ready, we'll get you girls home. I'm so thankful for your hard work tonight. You've made it a real success, but you've done more than enough, and it's time you went to bed. It's been a real pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed the experience, said Emma. Henrietta had already donned her apron and was elbow deep in a bowl of soapy water when Hyacinth walked into the kitchen. Whatever are you doing in the sink? These can all go into the dishwasher, said Hyacinth. It's your best spode tableware. We didn't want it to get chipped or to have the pattern fade, said Hetty. Nonsense. These can go in the dishwasher tomorrow. Now get your things if you're ready for home, and Conrad will call your taxi, said Hyacinth. She pressed her point home by physically removing Hetty's apron and pulling her away from the sink. I'll go and get Conrad now. I know he wants to thank you and to say goodbye. She returned to the kitchen, this time with Conrad, who was holding 2 splendid bouquets of flowers and 2 envelopes with a generous tip for the impromptu waitresses. Hetty and Emma remonstrated that they'd already had their wages, but it fell upon deaf ears. Conrad shook their hands and thanked them for all they'd done to make his birthday so special. After calling their taxi home and thanking them again, he returned to his guests. When he rejoined his friends, Theo and Beth had given up on the Schumann, but had promised to practice so as to try again, agreeing that it merited another evening's get-together. I can't match the standard of hospitality that we've enjoyed tonight, but it would be lovely if we could all spend another evening together. Theo and I will then give Schumann's Oriental Pictures the attention that it deserves, said Beth. This plan was heartily agreed upon, and the group settled on the sofas with their mugs of tea. The conversation meandered around the mutually favoured topics of music and art, and the good wines were adding a metaphysical element to the discussion. Conversation was still in full flow at midnight when the taxis arrived to take the guests home. Hearty handshakes and hugs with promises of happy evenings to come were exchanged. As the parties dispersed, a similar vein of conversation flowed between the respective couples. It was pleasant to find mutual friends with overlapping interests, and it was a welcome relief to talk about the more pleasant aspects of the artistic world after the shock of the theft and the discovery of a throttled museum curator. For the full book of Artful Designs, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.